It had been a week since he arrived in this strange new world. At first, he thought it was all a dream, but as the days passed, the vividness of his surroundings forced him to accept the truth. He wondered if this was some kind of afterlife, a consequence of the lightning strike that might have killed him. But regardless of the reason, one thing was clear. He had become the very villain of the game he once helped develop, Deculein von Grahan-Yukline. Deculein was the middle boss in the game, a character who, no matter which route players took, was the root of all problems and the enemy of everyone. He had caused pain and suffering for countless characters. The protagonist couldn't help but ask himself why he had to end up as a named villain of all people. Another major issue was that he had no idea where he was in the story. The only thing he knew for certain was the total amount of mana he possessed. However, he had no clue how quickly it would run out, leaving him completely unprepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. He reflected on the countless times he and his team had tested the game during development. They had run through it nearly 1,000 times, and in all those attempts, Deculein had only survived once. The character was designed solely to die, serving his purpose as the middle boss and nothing more. As he sat in Deculein's bedroom, he looked over the documents that had been given to him by Yeriel, Deculein's half-sister. The title of the document read, Imperial Senior Professor Deculein, A Fundamental Understanding of Magic and Attitude Toward Mana. The table of contents included topics like the distinction between magical attributes and types, an outline of circles for various magic branches such as destruction, support, summoning, and spirit, and the proper usage of mana. Yeriel von Grahan-Yukline, the woman who had thrown the stack of papers at him while he was sleeping, was Deculein's half-sister and the current head of House Yukline. It was worth noting that she didn't have a good relationship with Deculein. When Yeriel mentioned the woman, he assumed she was referring to Julie, the second daughter of the Northern Freyden family, the current fiancée of Deculein von Grahan-Yukline. Externally, the two were promised to each other, but their feelings towards each other were insanely different. Deculein seemed to love Julie with all his heart, but her feelings for him bordered on disgust. Remembering what Deculein's sister said about his fancy professor job, which he has to give a lecture on today, he decides to go. He realizes he has never given a lecture before, but he knows he has to do something to gather more information. Above all, the primary survival goal, he needed to become necessary to the game. Side quest, University Lecture, store currency plus 0.5. As he woke up, a notification floated above him. The combination of the floating words and the fact that Yeriel was among his death flags made him feel like he had to get moving. The store currency mentioned in the notification seemed particularly important, but one question lingered. What was he supposed to lecture on? Thankfully, he wasn't too worried. This body had the unique attribute called understanding. Grade, unique. Description, the ability to comprehend things. It's activated by consuming mana. Before he became Deculein, he had given this character the understanding attribute to make him slightly more sympathetic. Since it was a unique grade attribute that usually appeared later in the game, he suspected there were hidden effects he hadn't yet discovered. After taking a shower, he opened the door to the dressing room, a space larger than his old apartment, filled with valuables and suits. He chose his outfit based on instinct: a white shirt, an aristocratic navy suit, a black tie, and a coat. He sprayed himself with perfume, styled his hair meticulously, and looked in the mirror. Honestly, the style felt nauseatingly elegant to him. The overflowing ego of the outfit seemed arrogant, yet it carried a graceful dignity. He guessed it was the work of attributes like intimidating grace, aesthetic sense, and noble etiquette. It was as if the outfit was telling him that this body was truly his now. He found himself unable to even think of saying anything that might be considered rude. The formality that Kim Woojin, his former self, once found rigid, now felt natural. Although his main purpose was to gather information, walking toward his first lecture felt effortless. He was a noble, a superior member of the aristocracy, or so he pretended. In reality, he was still Kim Woojin, a completely ordinary man from South Korea, objectively tall and handsome, but as someone had once told him before they broke up, a pathetic, lazy bastard. He reminded himself not to lose sight of who he truly was. No matter how natural this new life felt, he couldn't let his guard down. Deculein stood in front of a vintage car parked in the yard, admiring its antique design. The vehicle, reminiscent of the modern Ford era, was a symbol of wealth in this world. As the attendant opened the door for him, he climbed into the back seat and noticed a small man sitting beside him. "Who is this guy?" Deculein wondered. The man stammered, "Professor. Good afternoon. Here it is." Deculein's thoughts raced. Is he my assistant? Or maybe my secretary? Out loud, he asked, "Are you a wizard?" The man looked confused. "Huh? I've been at your service for 3 years already." Deculein laughed elegantly. "I'm joking." He then turned his attention to the documents in his hands. At first, he thought they were lecture materials, but they turned out to be a script containing every detail of the lecture from start to finish. It dawned on him that there was no way Deculein, with his pride and lack of talent, had prepared this himself. The assistant must have done all the work. Deculein nodded and said, "Good work," which visibly confused both the assistant and the driver. He added, "Get some rest till we reach our destination." And the assistant reluctantly agreed. Deculein's thoughts, "Just how terrible of a person am I? I feel sick from having complimented someone. Is this Deculein's true self?" He realized that Deculein's consciousness was beginning to invade his own, a feeling that had started when he left the manor. About 30 minutes later, they arrived at their destination. The master attendant opened the door for Deculein, and he stepped out into the shimmering sunlight. The road leading to the entrance was lined with vibrant flowers and trees, and a towering statue of the first emperor stood proudly. The vast grounds of the Imperial University were filled with grand buildings, their surfaces gently illuminated by the soft beams of sunlight. It was a breathtaking sight, more real than any 3D rendering he had ever designed. This was his workplace now, Deculein's workplace. Every detail of the university was the result of his own design in the game. As he took it all in, a question crossed his mind. The area noted on the letter, was it the Roteo Hall? The lecture hall, Roteo Hall. The lecture hall was buzzing with anticipation as Deculein stepped onto the stage. A magic crystal amplified his voice, ensuring every word reached the audience. He began, "Attention everyone. My name is Deculein von Grahan-Yukline. I have taken this class as the head professor of the university's magic tower. Now, I'll begin my lecture." Some students, particularly a group of girls, were visibly impressed by his presence. They whispered among themselves, "Wow, he's handsome, and he's smart too. How cool." However, not everyone shared their enthusiasm. Nearby, a girl crumpled up a piece of paper in her hand, her face filled with fury. She thought to herself, "That's cool? Ha! At last we meet, the enemy of my father. Deculein, you trash bastard." Ifrin Luna's story began 3 years ago when her father took his own life. For many years, he had dedicated himself to researching spell interpretation. However, the shock of having his thesis extorted from him drove him into complete despair, ultimately leading to his death. The person who stole his work was later hailed as the genius spell interpreter by the public. That detestable person was none other than Deculein. Ifrin, however, was powerless to act at the time. After her father's death, she lost everything. Born into nobility, she watched as her family's house, territory, and wealth were stripped away, leaving her an orphan with no home. In the depths of her despair, she made a solemn pledge to take revenge on the man who had destroyed her family. With enormous effort, Ifrin managed to enroll in the Empire's Royal University, where Deculein served as a professor. While other students might not know the truth, she did. Deculein's so-called spell interpretation skill was nothing but a bluff, built entirely on her father's stolen achievements. It was through this stolen glory that he had ruined her family. As she watched Deculein stand arrogantly at the front of the lecture hall, Ifrin's anger burned. That position should have been her father's. She wanted to expose Deculein's lies and end his life right then and there, but she knew she had to hold back. To truly drag him down, she needed to prepare meticulously. Her revenge had to be perfect. Deculein stood at the podium, his voice commanding the room. "Silence. I'll begin the lecture now. Let me introduce myself again. I'm the head professor of this magic tower and a monarch mage who controls elements. My name is Deculein, the professor teaching this special lecture. Monarch is the 4th rank among mages, a position of significant power and prestige." He continued, "Those of you here today should already know that in magic, there are 3 big attributes and 9 types. The attributes are the origins, the source of magic, elements, the materials that make up objects, and vessels, the containers of mana. The types include summons, spirits, destruction, support, control, malleability, harmony, illusion, and specialized." As he spoke, Deculein couldn't help but reflect on how smoothly the lecture was going. Despite this being his first time teaching and his unfamiliarity with the theory of magic, he was able to perfectly understand everything thanks to his unique attribute. The traits of overpowering grace and elitism also came into play, making his delivery natural and captivating. He thought to himself, maybe the current Deculein possesses the traits of a good teacher. Deculein moved on to explain the use of mana. The use of mana differs depending on where it is stored in the body. Normally, mages store mana in the head, which is the easiest place to imagine spells. Knights store theirs in the heart, emitting it from the blood vessels all over their bodies. Lastly, there is the inner core, which mixes internal and external mana. It is the most universal place for mana storage. As he spoke, he glanced at his watch. 40 minutes had passed. He concluded the lecture with a piece of advice that felt oddly fitting for his own situation. What I want to say is simple. Hard work is important, but if you're not talented, then you need to choose and focus. Internally, Deculein found this statement amusing. That's something befitting of Deculein. To be honest, he doesn't have amazing talent. His current mana is at 3,375, but there's also a named mage whose primary mana is at 30,000. It's amusing how he's saying something that he should take note of the most. As he reached the end of the script, Deculein noticed something unusual. The final line seemed out of place. He thought to himself, the last part of the script seems strange. Must I read this? If it were the original Deculein, he wouldn't have read this sentence. He decided to read it. Are there any questions? The auditorium fell into silence. Just as he was about to breathe a sigh of relief, a hand shot up. It was Ifrin Luna. She stood and asked, Professor Deculein, last night, a mysterious spell was discovered in the dormitories. It's assumed to be an act of the devil. But what does Professor Deculein, the genius spell interpreter, think? Deculein's response was sharp. Are you really from the university's magic tower? Ifrin was taken aback. Pardon? Why are you asking that? Deculein replied with aristocratic elegance. If you are, then it should be second nature for you to state your name and affiliation. I will not answer questions from a child who doesn't know how to follow basic etiquette. Ifrin was embarrassed. Woojin internally said sorry to her, but he was in a rush. He realized that using understanding had consumed an enormous amount of mana, 1,300 points, leaving him with only 2,005 out of 3,375. He couldn't afford to waste more mana on a spell he'd never seen before. As the student laughed at Ifrin, but she pressed on, Please wait. Right now the magic tower is refusing to analyze it, calling it a rumor. If it's you, then I think you could figure out the type of magic used. I request that you interpret this spell. A loud sound rang in Deculein's ears, causing him to stop in his tracks and turn his head. He glanced at the magic circle Ifrin had presented. Unknowingly, his understanding attribute activated. His vision turned blue, his mind accelerated, and time seemed to slow down. In less than a second, his mana plummeted from 3,375 to a mere 360. Despite the drastic drain, he barely managed to identify the spell. Illusion type. Barrier magic. Ifrin, unaware of the toll it had taken on Deculein, continued speaking. The rest of the freshmen in the dormitory are working hard to analyze this, but since it's vacation right now, there aren't enough seniors or professors to ask for help. Professor, if you could give us a hint, that would... He spoke calmly. It's barrier magic. There's no need for hints. It's an illusion-type barrier spell. Seems like someone wanted to trap you all. That's all. Ifrin was left stunned. The side quest was completed. University lecture. Store currency plus 0.5.